Boldwood presents Murder in the Highlands, written by Debbie Young and read by Laura Kerman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. In the afternoon, a customer spent an hour wandering around the shop. He finally came to the counter and said, "I never buy second-hand books. You don't know who else has touched them or where they've been." Sean Bithell, proprietor of the bookshop in Wigtown, in the Diary of a Bookseller. Chapter 1. On the Wrong Track. "Don't do it, Sophie!" cried Carol, clasping her hands as if in prayer. I set a bar of chocolate on the shop counter and reached into my handbag for my purse. "But it's the smallest one in the shop," I protested, handing her a £1 coin. "And I'll share it with Hector when I get to work. Whatever's left of it by then, anyway." Lately, I'd got into the bad habit of treating myself each morning to some chocolate from the village shop on my way to Hector's house, the bookshop where I ran the tea room. Carol's admonishing remark pricked my conscience. "I'm not talking about the chocolate, you dafty." She scanned the barcode on the chocolate wrapper and pressed the button to open the till. After dropping my coin into the cash drawer, she pressed my change into my open palm, and when I curled my fingers over it, she wrapped both her hands around mine and held them there. "I mean your elopement," she continued. "Running away with Hector to get married is a great mistake. You'll hurt your parents, your friends, and your neighbours. And you'll find out all too late that you've hurt yourself too. Take my advice. Give that Gretna Garbo a miss." She meant Gretna Green, of course, the historic village just north of the border, famous as the wedding destination of eloping couples. There was the tinkle of broken glass from the stockroom at the back of the shop, where Carol's new boyfriend, Ted, was unpacking the day's deliveries from their wholesaler. Theirs was a midlife romance, and they'd been dating only since Valentine's Day. Carol glanced down the aisle in his direction. "You okay, love?" An affirmative grunt was his reply, followed by the sound of footsteps on the stairs to the flat above the shop. He'd either gone to find a plaster for the damage he'd done to himself with whatever he'd broken, or to make himself a restorative cup of tea. Ted was a sturdy chap, in his 50s like Carol, and clumsy. His presence as a part-time voluntary shop assistant was possibly a mixed blessing, but he did supply excellent fresh bread every day from his home-based bakery. Before I could respond to Carol's advice, the Reverend Murray, who had been lingering by the R to S shelves, deliberating between rich tea biscuits and shortbread, came to join us, a packet of each in his hands. "Good morning, Sophie." His expression was unusually serious. "I must say I'm disappointed to hear you prefer a civil ceremony to a church wedding, especially when you have our beautiful parish church of St. Bride's at your disposal, with all your friends and neighbours nearby." He set the biscuits down on the counter. "Would you be so kind as to put these on my account, please, Carol?" Carol pulled the old-fashioned ledger out from under the counter and flipped it open at the M section. The vicar must have known that Carol's disastrous elopement when she was a young woman had coloured her advice to me. But her situation then was entirely different from mine now. I'd been in a stable relationship with Hector for a year, whereas hers had been a rash, unguarded decision to run away with a man she barely knew. Besides which, I had no intention of getting married for a very long time, not even to Hector. After all, I was only 26. I was in no rush, and nor was he. "Why is everyone convinced Hector and I are eloping to Gretna Green?" I tried not to sound as cross as I felt. "All we're doing is taking a short holiday in Scotland to visit my parents. He's never spent any time with them. Their only previous encounter was at Great Auntie May's funeral." Carol shook her head mournfully. "Ah, dear old May Sayers." May had been a good friend to Carol and her parents, especially during her mother's final, protracted illness. "That's another reason you should have your wedding in the village. You'd be able to leave your bouquet on May's grave at the end of the day. I'd leave mine on my parents' grave if anyone ever asked me to marry them." She gazed wistfully towards the stockroom. "Not forgetting the colour and joy that our choir and bell ringers can add to your special day," added the vicar, ever loyal to anyone who took part in the communal life of the church. "And, after all, What better place can there be for a wedding than a church called St. Bride's? I wonder which hymns you would choose for yours. I began to consider which would best suit the voices of our village choir, whose strongest attribute was their willingness. Then I clapped my hand to my face to bring myself to my senses, astonished at how easily these two village stalwarts were leading me astray. "Listen, we're really not planning on getting married," I declared. "Either here or at Gretna Green or anywhere else along the way." I slipped my bar of chocolate into my pocket. "We're just visiting my parents. I've hardly seen my parents since I moved to Wendlebury. It's high time they got to know Hector, and for him to get to know them too." Carol finished recording the vicar's brace of biscuit packets, closed the accounts book, and replaced it on its shelf below the counter. As she returned her attention to me, she brightened. "Ah, I see. You're going to get your parents' approval before you get married." She smiled as she scanned the barcodes on the vicar's biscuits to remove them from stock. "Call me old-fashioned, but I think that's an excellent idea. I only wish—" She stopped short of elaborating on her own experience. The vicar chipped in to spare her embarrassment. "Who wouldn't approve of their daughter marrying a decent, honest, hard-working type like Hector Munro?" He beamed. "And vice versa, my dear. Your match would certainly have my blessing." I bit my lip. "I appreciate your endorsement, Vicar, but it's just a holiday. Hector's not had a proper break all year, and he's never been to Scotland. But we're heading for Inverness, not Gretna Green." I chose not to reveal that we'd passed very close to Gretna on the way, keen to curtail the ever-active village rumour mill before things got completely out of hand. After bidding them both goodbye, I left the shop and headed up the high street to the bookshop, too distracted to remember the chocolate in my pocket until I was almost there. The pair's comments had made me realise there was another subconscious reason for our trip to Scotland that I hadn't acknowledged even to myself. I wanted Hector to understand my affection for Inverness and the Highlands, where I'd spent my formative teenage years, and for him and my parents to get to know each other. But I also needed to reassure myself that away from our mutual comfort zone, Hector was a keeper. Chapter 2. Second Best. "Who's Maggie Burton?" I asked Hector as we sat in the tea room during a quiet spell later that morning, deliberating over applications for temporary staff to run Hector's house while we were away. I held up a handwritten letter on mauve-deckled edged notepaper. It was an old-fashioned brand my Auntie May had favoured for correspondence when she wasn't abroad on her travel-writing expeditions. Most of my letters from her had been penned on crisp, fine, pale blue air-letter stationery, and boasted a fine array of picturesque stamps from around the world. I'd kept them all. Hector groaned, covering his face with his hands. "Oh, please, not Maggie Burton." He peeked at me through his fingers. "You know, the lady who wanted the blue book." I poured us each another cup of tea. "Oh, yes, I remember." I grimaced in sympathy. Maggie Burton was a relative newcomer to the village, having recently moved into a 60s bungalow set back in an old orchard just off the main road. She had made her first visit to the shop during the week that I was away in Greece. Her book requests had since become legendary at Hector's house for their obscurity, and Hector had been known to hide when he saw her coming, leaving me to decipher her descriptions. The latest request had been for a book by David Attenborough about interior design. It was blue and had a picture of a whale on the cover, she'd said confidently. After what felt like a round of the old parlour game of 20 questions, I'd realised it was the recent memoir by a marine wildlife documentary maker, which included anecdotes of filming David Attenborough's Blue Planet series. The whale in your living room had been on display in our shop window for the last week. I'd fetched it for her only to have her say, "You see, I told you it was blue." Then, as with all the books we found for her, she'd held it, sniffed it, glanced at the back cover without reading the blurb, and turned her watery grey eyes on me in appeal. "But do you think I'll enjoy it?" The thought of Maggie Burton manning the trade counter, even for the single week that Hector and I would be in Scotland, was too alarming for us to take her application seriously. Can you imagine? I can picture her asking every customer who comes to the trade counter to buy a book. "But do you think you'll enjoy it?" "Ha! Hector got up to fetch a cookie jar from the tea-room counter, unscrewing the lid on his way back to our table and offering me a chocolate biscuit before taking one himself. "Perhaps I should create a new position for her, Sales Prevention Officer. Who else have we got?" I picked up the other envelope, a plain white one addressed in careful block capitals, and slit it open with the knife beside my tea plate. Carefully I removed the sheet of paper it contained. "Oh, it's from Ted." "Really? I thought he was fully employed in between his baking and helping Carol." Ted's small but enthusiastic round of local retail deliveries took up the early part of his day, and Carol's shop the rest of it, not to mention the actual baking. "We'd better not let him loose in the tea room," I said, remembering his accident in Carol's stockroom earlier. He'd wrecked the place on his first day. I felt very protective of the tea room. In the year since Hector had employed me, I'd been steadily building up the financial contribution it made to the bookshop, which needed every extra income stream we could think of to keep it in profit. Even though the business belonged entirely to Hector, I'd have hated Ted to undo my hard work. Hector took the letter from me and read it in silence. "To be fair, he's got a lovely way with people despite his shyness. I can see him holding the fort at the trade counter well enough. After all, you can't easily break a book or do any damage with one. Plus, he's physically fit and strong. He'd easily lift any heavy deliveries, and he's tall enough to reach the top shelves without a ladder. Then I think the decision is a no-brainer, provided he can finish his bread deliveries before our opening time. Bakers usually start and finish early, don't they? Like milkmen. So what happens next? Will you talk to him about it, or do you want me to? I can nab him in the village shop on my way home if you like." Hector gave a wry grin. "Yes, it's probably better if you handle the next stage of the recruitment process. You know my usual form from when I recruited you last year, Sophie." I had to smile. "What, you mean get the candidate tiddly, then sleep with them a few months down the line?" When I'd applied, Hector had been distilling hooch to slip into the tea of favourite customers, describing it as his special cream. I was thankful I'd persuaded him to put a stop to that this summer before it landed him in trouble. He reached across the table to take my hands and gave them a tender squeeze. "Play your cards right, sweetheart, and you could be on course for a promotion." I pulled a hand free to cuff his head affectionately before starting to clear the paperwork away. As his only employee, I didn't see how promotion could be possible, even though Hector acknowledged the business had benefited from my marketing instincts and ideas. When I'd started working at Hector's house, the tea room had just been a service to customers of the bookshop. I'd turned it into a destination in its own right. Yet after 12 months, I was still working the same hours and earning the same wages. Perhaps when we came back from Scotland, I should press him for a pay rise. I'd think about it. "So, if Ted runs the bookshop while we're away, where does that leave the tea room?" I tried to keep my voice neutral. "Without the tea room, he'll sell far fewer books." Hector blinked hard twice, as if rebooting his thought process. "How about Mrs. Weatherly?" She was the lady who provided our home-baked cakes, scones and biscuits, a recently retired food technology teacher. She regarded her service to us as a way of financing what was now her hobby of baking. It also relieved her of the need to either eat all her produce herself or to hold enough tea parties and coffee mornings for friends and relations to eat it for her. Hector frowned. "I'm not sure she'd want to be in the shop 9 till 5. She might get bored and rather be baking." I bit back a retort about whether I might ever crave more action as I manned the tea room all day. "Maybe if you said she could bake on the premises, so she's not having to go home and bake in the evenings to replenish stock. That might even be an advantage, wafting delicious baking aromas around the shop, along with a scent of fresh coffee." Hector gazed at me for a moment before his face relaxed into a smile. "That's an excellent idea, Sophie. I'm not sure there's room to make it work on a long-term basis, as there's not much room to move behind the counter, and the cooker is quite small. But she might make it work just for the week we're away. I'll phone her tonight and ask her." "Well done." He slapped his thighs. "So that's all sorted then, assuming Ted and Mrs. Weatherly say yes, anyway." I tidied away our cups and returned the cookie jar to its usual place on the tea-room counter, feeling glum that I could be so easily replaced. What's more, Mrs. Weatherly was a much better baker than me. Chapter 3. Packing up our troubles. As I sat on Hector's bed, watching him fill his battered backpack for our departure the next morning, I realised I'd been putting off describing my parents for fear of, putting him off. Dad says Mum lost her spark after Susie died. Hector was rolling 7 pairs of socks into 7 neat balls and stuffing them into the bottom of the backpack, eyes narrowed in concentration. "Who's Susie?" I leaned back against the headboard, drew my knees up and looped my arms around them. Mum's best friend. Mum's late best friend. After growing up virtually in each other's pockets in their home village in Kent, and going through their entire school education together, they went to different universities and never lived close to each other again. But they stayed in touch, and every year or so, they'd get together at Susie's or at ours and make up for lost time. They were quite different in lots of ways. Susie was a scientific boffin type, while Mum studied languages. Susie was a night owl, always wanting to be out after dark, stargazing, while Mum's a lark, the sort who'd happily go for a run before breakfast or an early morning dip, but be spark out by 9 p.m. Susie couldn't have cared less about her looks, while Mum has always taken pride in her appearance. Hector pulled a couple of pairs of jeans from his wardrobe and laid them on the bed. "Yes, I remember thinking at May's funeral that she was very attractive for her age." He ducked to avoid the pillow I threw at him. But they got along because they respected each other's interests and indulged them. All very well until they went one step too far, about 10 years ago, when I was still at school. Susie, overzealous in embracing Mum's passion for swimming, managed to get herself drowned when she came up to visit Mum in Scotland, and they went on a trip to the Outer Hebrides together. Hector set down the pair of jeans he'd been rolling up and came to sit beside me, putting a comforting arm about my shoulders. "How on earth did that happen? Don't they have lifeguards at Scottish swimming pools?" I looked away. It wasn't at a swimming pool, not the indoor kind that you mean. They were outdoors on a beautiful beach on the Isle of Harris, the sort with pearly white sand and turquoise seas, a vast, deserted beach backed by wild macaire. "Wild what?" "Macaire. That's a sort of grassy dune area that marks where the beach meets the land. It's really pretty." Hector turned to kiss my temple. "Sounds more like the Maldives. I had no idea they had beaches like that in Scotland." I rested my head on his shoulder. "There's a lot you don't know about Scotland yet." Anyway, they'd gone to stay on Lewis and Harris for a couple of days. They're actually 2 halves of the same island. Susie was enraptured by the clarity of the sky at night. No light pollution, you see. Mum fell asleep stargazing with Susie. And the next thing she knew, Susie was gone. She tried to take a moonlit dip while Mum was asleep, and not knowing the area like Mum did. She'd been ignorant of the local tide patterns and had been swept out to sea and drowned. That beautiful sea may look innocuous, but strong currents and the cold can take you unaware and kill you in no time. They found Susie's body the next day, washed up further along the beach. My voice cracked with emotion. I cleared my throat. "So, long story short, don't expect Mum to come with us if we want to go swimming. She hasn't swum since, not even indoors. Man-made swimming pools never appealed to her anyway. It's such a shame for her. Dad said she's like a born singer, silenced." Hector put his other arm round me and drew me close to him. "I'm glad we've been stocking that book on wild swimming tips this summer. You never know, if Susie had read a book like that, perhaps she'd be here still." He shuddered. "To be honest, I've never understood the appeal of wild swimming. It's just common sense that it's dangerous. Why take avoidable risks?" "When I was growing up, we just called it swimming. It was our thing. Mum and I would swim. You can't really understand until you've tried it. The raw freedom, the feeling of being a part of the stunning scenery, the thrilling tingle of the chilly water that makes you feel so alive. So, Mum and I swam, while Dad did his hills." "Hills? What sort of hills?" "What did he do in the hills?" Hector got to his feet to resume his packing, while I sat, cross-legged, twiddling my hair. "What do you mean, what hills?" "The Munros, of course." He gazed at me blankly. "You know, all the Scottish mountains over 3,000 feet high." so called because they were first mapped by a certain Sir Hugh Munro. Dad's a Munro bagger. Gotta climb them all. Honestly, Hector, how did you reach your age with your name without knowing about the Munros? I pulled one of the pillows out from under me and hugged it to my chest. Well, you know now, and you'll know even better once Dad's taking you up one, if Mum lets him. Hector pushed his hands down inside the backpack to compact his clothes before starting to add books from the pile beside the bed. Why wouldn't she let him? We're both grown-ups. I hugged the pillow. Susie's accident made her risk-averse. I'm lucky she still lets me go swimming at indoor pools, which in the Highlands are fabulous, by the way, and there's a pool in Inverness that even has a little outdoor pool shaped like a thistle, but it's not the same as proper outdoor swimming in the wild. You have packed your swimming trunks, haven't you? I couldn't remember seeing him put them in. Hector paused in the middle of buckling up the top of the backpack. To be honest, I don't currently own any. He looked away. What? How do I even go out with you? Hector raised his hands in surrender. Okay. I'll buy some when we get there if you really want me to. He ran one hand through his dark curls. I decided to be merciful and move back into his comfort zone. Don't forget Mum's book, either. That's all under control. I left it on the trade counter when we shut up shop tonight, so that I'll remember to pick it up first thing in the morning, after I've given Ted and Mrs. Weatherly their final briefing. I said quickly, after we've briefed them. I can show Mrs. Weatherly what's what in the tea room while you take care of Ted. We want to get away as soon as we can. It's a 500-mile journey, you know. I wished I'd learned to drive so that we could take turns at the wheel, instead of him having to do all the work. Now there's a cue for a song, said Hector, and I knew he'd been setting that one up to play on the shop's sound system at the first opportunity. I was glad he'd acquired a great gift to take from my mum, a vintage book of Gaelic poetry that he'd bought at a car boot sale back in January when we were visiting his parents in the little Somerset seaside town of Clevedon. After all, for me this trip would be a homecoming. For Hector, it was a venture into a strange land. I hadn't realised just how alien he might find it until we'd had this conversation. Perhaps the Gaelic book might serve as a talisman, the bookseller's equivalent of a St. Christopher medallion to ensure safe passage and a trouble-free return. Chapter 4. A Wendlebury Send-Off. By Monday morning, my fears had inverted. Now I was more anxious that Hector might dislike my parents rather than the other way around. Faced with the prospect of intolerable indoors, he might call our relationship off. Lovely as he was, working for an ex-boyfriend would be awkward. Besides, I enjoyed my job, despite my growing misgivings about the pay and status, and I'd be upset to have to give it up because of relationship issues. By the time the bookshop opened, I was anxious to be on our way. With an estimated 9-hour drive ahead of us, not including stops, I'd have preferred an earlier start. But I gave in to Hector's insistence on a final brief to Ted and Mrs. Weatherly, despite them already having had a couple of hours training. I'd spent the night at my cottage, enjoying a little solitude before spending every minute of the next week in Hector's company. When I arrived at the shop to meet Hector, I was surprised to find Kate, Hector's godmother, who also lived in the village, behind the trade counter. She beamed when she saw me. "Hector asked me to keep an eye on the workers while you're away," she said in a low voice while Hector was showing Ted something in the stockroom. "I'll just pop in first thing and last thing each day to troubleshoot, and now and again if I'm passing. So no need to worry, Sophie. Just relax and enjoy your holiday. Look after him." I suspect Kate, as Hector's godmother, still thinks of him as a little boy. I smiled indulgently. To be honest, knowing Kate was going to oversee both the shop and the tea room was reassuring. She's very sensible, having served on just about every committee in the community, and is regarded around the village as a safe pair of hands. "I think he can take care of himself, actually," I replied. "After all, he's bigger and stronger than I am. Well, a few inches taller and wider anyway, but I'll do my best to bring him back in one piece. I promise you." In the end, I had to physically frog-march Hector out of the shop, interrupting his lecture to an increasingly anxious Mrs. Weatherly. She'd looked perfectly confident before he started on her. "Come on, Hector, your shop will be fine." I picked up my backpack and heaved it onto my shoulder. We're only a phone call away if they get stuck with anything. I thought it better not to mention the frequent mobile black spots in the Highlands. Just as we were stowing our luggage in the back of the Land Rover, Tommy and his little sister Sina came racing up the high street, almost bumping into us as they screeched to a halt. Tommy produced from his parka pocket a small glass jar containing a caramel-coloured liquid. Sina reached out a hand to hold it too, indicating it was a gift from them both. "Local honey from Wendlebury Barrow hives," I read from the label. "It's for your honeymoon," Sina explained, sounding pleased with herself, "to help you have a happy marry in Scotland." Hector and I exchanged glances. We'd thought we'd managed to quash the elopement rumour, but we didn't want to hurt the children's feelings. Old Billy emerged from around the corner, where Hector parked his Land Rover. Tommy and Sina turned to grin at him conspiratorially. "All done, kiddies." Billy tapped a finger against the side of his nose. "Now, I'll race you to the churchyard. Remember the pair of you said you'd help me weed it after you know what." He turned to Hector and me and raised his battered cap. "Now, off with the pair of you," he said, giving Hector the hugest of winks. "You don't want to be late for your own wedding. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, boy." He returned his attention to me. "And don't you let him get away with nothing. He'll be under your thumb once you've married him, even if he is technically your boss in his shop. Bon voyage to you both, or whatever they say in Scottish." Leaving Hector and I lost for words, he followed the giggling children up the high street. Hector closed the back door of the Land Rover and we climbed aboard. Only as we pulled out onto the high street did we become aware of a dreadful metallic rattling and scraping sound. Fearing damage to his precious vehicle, Hector parked outside the shop, jumped down from the driver's seat and darted to the rear of the Land Rover to check the course of the stomach-churning noise. I heard a rip of cardboard and turned to see him holding up a large, hand-painted sign bearing the words, "Just Married," with "Later Today" in brackets underneath. I immediately guessed the metallic sound had come from a traditional string of tin cans that Billy, Tommy and Sina must have tied to the rear bumper. Hector paused by my window to speak to me, and I wound it down. "I'll just get the scissors," he said levelly, and disappeared inside the shop. A moment later, he returned holding up the Gaelic book to show me. "Maybe we should be thankful after all. If it hadn't been for those scallywags, we'd have driven off leaving your mum's book on the trade counter." Kate followed, scissors in hand. She swiftly cut off the strings of tin cans while Hector slipped the book into his pocket and climbed back into the driving seat. "Now, for goodness sake, you two, just go," she waved, the scissors in one hand and the string of old cans dangling from the other. At last, we were on our way. Chapter 5. An Urgent Call. As soon as we'd passed the "You're leaving Wendlebury Barrow" sign, on which some wag had graffitied, "But why?" I began to relax, leaning back into the canvas seat and raising my feet onto the dashboard. "You know what I'm looking forward to in Scotland?" I asked, and continued without waiting for him to answer. "Clear air, big skies, the constant sound of running water from the River Ness, spotting waterfalls along the way, coffee and cake at I Should Cocoa, the coffee shop where I had a part-time job when I was in the sixth form, and swimming, of course." "Oh," said Hector, non-committal. I turned to gaze at his profile. "Sorry, did you think I was going to say spending time with my parents?" He took his eyes off the road for just long enough to cast me a mournful look. "Actually, I rather hoped you were going to say spending a week of uninterrupted leisure with me." "Oh, yes, that too. Plus, I'm really looking forward to showing you all of my favourite places in and around Inverness. McNabb's bookshop, the local park with the miniature railway, my favourite cafe, the River Ness, Loch Ness, the monster. You never know your luck." I settled down to enjoy the ride. As we negotiated the little maze of country lanes to take us to the motorway, the morning sun sparkled in a gentle autumnal way. Dewy emerald green and chocolate brown freshly ploughed fields ran in folds over the Cotswold hills, like a crumpled patchwork bedspread laid over the fat curves of a sleeping giant. Hector sighed. In early autumn, the countryside around here is so beautiful. I'm beginning to wonder why we didn't choose a holiday destination closer to home. I waved a hand dismissively at the landscape, radiant beneath the morning sun and a cloudless, clear blue sky. Just you wait till you get to Scotland. The hills north of the border are so magnificent, they make the Cotswolds look like speed bumps. And if you think our local sheep are cute, you'll be blown away by the Highland coos. That's Highland cattle to you, you great Sassenach. Hector braked at the junction at the top of Frocester Hill to give way to a tractor tootling along the main road. Are they the orange ones with the big tusks like woolly mammoths? I laughed. Not tusks, silly, they're horns. But mammoth in scale, I'll give you that. We crossed the main road and passed through light woodland before starting our descent of the last Cotswold hill into the Severn Vale. The great river glinted in the distance like a twist of silvery thread in front of the long, low, shadowy Welsh hills. Then Hector's mobile began to trill. I sighed as I reached across to extract it from his top pocket. Not the shop calling already, surely? He shook his head in silent apology as I pressed the green answer icon. Hello, this is Sophie, Hector's driving, I said, expecting to hear Ted and trying not to sound as irritated as I felt at our holiday being interrupted so soon. I hit the speaker icon. Sophie, darling, it's Kate. Hector shot me a worried side-eye glance. Nothing to worry about, she added quickly, as if psychically attuned to Hector's mood. It's just that I was looking for a book and I wondered whether you could help me. Hector rolled his eyes. Is that meant to be a Maggie Burton impression? He hissed in a low voice before saying loud enough for Kate to hear. Which book is that, Kate? The one in Gaelic that was lying on the counter earlier, she replied. So annoying. I know it was there when you came back in for scissors, and now it's nowhere to be found. Hector's brow furrowed. I've got it with me, Kate. It's in my jacket pocket. Why do you ask? The line crackled as the road dipped. Someone was after it just now. A fellow called into the shop just after you left. He'd heard you had it and was after it for himself. Really, Hector, I didn't know you'd already started up for second-hand trade. I thought you were waiting to do that when you got back. You might have briefed us about it. Hector frowned. Are you sure it's the same book, Kate? A collection of Gaelic poetry in the original Gaelic. I don't understand how anyone would know I'd got it. Does it have an inscription on the front page in the name of Malcolm Nicholson? Asked Kate. Yes, I replied. Hector turned to stare at me in amazement before an oncoming driver tooted his horn to indicate the Land Rover had strayed slightly across the central white line. Hector steered back within the lane boundary before replying. Was it someone local? He inquired. Someone who'd seen the book on the trade counter? I wish I'd known there was a Gaelic speaker in the village. I'd have asked them to translate the inscription for me. Going through a mental roll call of our neighbours, I couldn't think of a single Scot. Oh, no, he wasn't local, replied Kate. He told me he'd just driven up from Clevedon. Ah, that's a well-known Gaelic-speaking quarter of Somerset, said Hector sardonically. I'm still puzzled, Kate. How did he know I had the book? I haven't listed it for sale online. We haven't put any of our second-hand stock in our online catalogue yet. That was a project for our return, once we'd decided exactly how we were going to operate Hector's new second-hand department. That was my brainchild as a new income stream for Hector's house. Apparently your mum put him on to you. She remembered you buying it at some car boot sale you visited with her earlier this year, and she gave him the details of your shop. She thought you'd welcome a customer for your new second-hand business. Hector paused as he negotiated the roundabout to join the M5. But that was back in January. How does he know my mum? Kate sighed. After all, she had only asked a simple question.